Hello and welcome to the One Piece Deep Dive, an analysis series breaking down the story of Eiichiro Oda's modern epic, One Piece. This video is intended as an introduction to the series where I'll break down my overall goals and expectations for what's to come. One Piece is a series that started in 1997 and is still going on to this day in the year 2025, and has risen to become one of the most successful manga of all time. There are a few different ways to experience One Piece. There is, of course, the original manga, as well as the anime done by Toei Animation. And lastly, there is the live action series done by Netflix. Wit Studio has also started making their own animated adaptation for One Piece, but as of this recording, that series is still working on its first season. For this series, I will be looking exclusively at the manga. That means I will not be using any information that was added in the anime or using data books for reference. I will, however, take into consideration the SBS segments, which are the Q&A segments that Oda features in the volume releases of One Piece. And while I wouldn't call any of the information shared in them absolutely necessary for understanding the overall story, the inclusion of them in the volume releases of One Piece make it so they're part of the overall reading experience. And while I'm sure it's obvious, there'll be spoilers for this whole series throughout. Now, you might think that analyzing the manga story would be as simple as just reading the official translation, but One Piece has had quite the history with English localization, having pretty rough translations early on, as well as spreading out much of the translation work to different people to try to speed up the process later. It would only be until around volume 65 where Stephen Paul, who did his own fan translations for those early volumes, would be picked up by Viz as a consistent translator. Since then, the translations have been much more consistent, albeit with a few small kinks still. Even years after Funimation has gotten rights to the dub, Viz has continued to refer to Zoro as Zolo in its text, which was initially done to be in line with the infamous 4Kids dub of the anime. Something I assume makes hardcore Zoro fans wince every time they read the official translations. So the English translation of the manga has been a bit inconsistent, especially during its earlier chapters. I found myself at an impasse, as part of this review series is going through the narrative again through fresh eyes and seeing how the story stacks up in retrospect. But I also want to analyze the story as a consistent narrative, which can be difficult when localizers are playing hot potato with the early translations. Ultimately, I decided to stick with the official English translation done by Viz, but with Stephen Paul's early fan translations for the side as reference. Now, unlike a series like Dragon Ball, where Toriyama famously wrote the series week to week with little to no larger plan in mind, Oda famously planned much of his story ahead. Not everything, mind you. If anything, Oda's ability to pivot the story to suit new elements is one of his best talents. A great talent which has sparked up a pretty consistent debate for how much of the story Oda has had planned since the beginning. For instance, Haki is a set of abilities that dominates much of the action in the second half of the narrative. Given how Oda only gave a full explanation for the power system well into the story, there is quite a lot of speculation on when exactly Oda decided to include Haki as a narrative tool, at least in its modern incarnation. Whether it was initially various different powers that he just rolled together into one system, or something he planned out since the very beginning, we likely won't get a clear answer to this until sometime after the story concludes. So until that day comes where we truly know how much of One Piece was really planned from the very start, we can only really speculate. Which actually brings me to one of my personal side quests for this series. I would like to try to figure out, based on a blend of retrospective knowledge and narrative analysis, figure out how much of One Piece was really planned based on when certain elements began to appear in the story. While of course the series isn't done, so there's definitely a non-zero chance that I'll miss some form of subtle foreshadowing, or a hidden Japanese pun somewhere that secretly spoils the entire story, I do think there's enough of the narrative here to look back and see how much of the foundation was made with the greater story in mind. So that about covers everything I wanted to set up before jumping into the series. I hope you're interested in joining me on this journey of overanalyzing fictional pirates. I am well aware of the daunting task ahead of me. It took Lance 10 years to finish their analysis of the Dragon Ball manga, but One Piece is over twice that size and is still growing as I record this. Looking at it from that angle, this task looks nearly impossible. But then again, what is One Piece about if not looking at the face of what's considered impossible and deciding to seize it anyway despite the odds. So, welcome one and all. I am N, and I invite you to join me on this quest to say everything I want to about my favorite series of all time. See you in the next video where we'll begin our retrospective proper, starting with the Romance Dawn arc.